Good morning. My name is Maurice Crespi. I'm the managing partner of Schindler's Attorneys, co-founder of COBRA. Thanks so much for joining today. As you probably know by now, COBRA has been set up by the IQbusiness group, engaged business turnaround, and Schindler's Attorneys. And the idea is to help businesses in distress. It's turned into South Africa's largest corporate pro bono initiative. We'd imagine, in fact, in South Africa's history. And we have now over 30 partners who've jumped on board and who have pledged to assist wherever possible, to assist businesses in their time of need, but all the way down from the spaza shop. In fact, we've engaged consultants who are assisting at that level, all the way up to big business, where you'd have the IQbusiness assisting at that level. COBRA, the pro bono initiative, involves us presenting webinars such as today, but we also, if you want, we can set up private Zoom sessions with you and your team. We can answer specific queries in relation to your business, and that's pro bono. So please, 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 there's no reason why not to. We have the advice available, and we also have a fantastic knowledge base that is on the COBRA website. That's cobra.org.za, and the knowledge base, we're told, is actually the best in the country. It's updated daily. It's really, really, really useful. In fact, we've got quite a few compliments in relation to that database. So today we are on the couch with Adam Craker and Sifiso Skenjana. They'll be discussing growth beyond COVID-19. They'll be considering the growth during COVID-19, the old model of growth versus the new model of growth, and how the old fits into the new based on the fact that we don't expect things to go back to the way they used to be. That's a practical certainty. Adam is the Chief Executive Officer at IQbusiness. That's IQbusiness is the largest independent management consulting firm in South Africa. He joined IQbusiness in 2009 and is appointed CEO in November 2010. He's a lobbyist for government and business collaboration. He places a specific emphasis on education, which he believes is the key ingredient to drive an all-inclusive future for South Africans. He's forged strong partnerships between IQbusiness and various NGOs, such as Smart Start, Tomorrow Trust, Harambee Partners for Possibility, that acts for catalysts for positive trends in education. Other milestones include the creation of growth.co.za. He's also the founding partner of Sleep Out. We've all heard of Sleep Out, and other charitable initiatives. He's had previous positions at Supergroup, Dimension Data, Merchants, Accenture, and he's a member of the Young Presidents Organization. So we then have Sifiso, who is an absolutely brilliant and insightful economist. We often have him on Friday afternoons. In fact, he's become a regular, and the show is really, really popular, so also join us then. He is the lead of the internal research and thought leadership team at IQbusiness. He has 11 years industry experience. Prior to joining IQbusiness, he founded and managed an economic research and strategy advisory company. He has previously held roles in asset management, strategy, and management consulting. He has an MSc for SA Business School and is currently pursuing his PhD focusing on development finance and economics. He's a columnist for Business Day, Fin24, and the Sunday Times, and he's a regular commentator in ENCA, Newsroom, Power FM, KFM, and SAFM. So we're very, very lucky today to be joined by the two of them, two very, very powerful individuals. And I must add, had it not been for Adam, COBRA would not be where it is today, and we're indebted to him. So Adam, over to you. Thank you so much.
Chris, thank you very much to you for that splendid introduction. I guess we haven't got any time left now for the, for the session. I really appreciate it, and I have to say it's been a great journey so far over the last 8 weeks, working together on COBRA. So really wonderful to have this opportunity to connect with everybody on the webinar on the subject of growth beyond COVID-19. And Sifiso, who will pop up now on the screen, I bumped into him about 15 minutes ago over by the coffee machine in our building in the other wing. And in the first instance, we practiced social distancing. We didn't get too close, and we had our masks in place. But we had a quick chat about so what are we doing today on this subject matter, and I hope that the discussion that we can have about opening up the economy and the intent and the steps that we heard from the presidential announcement on Sunday night, we can just drill down on. Perhaps we can also talk through the premise that one should never waste a good crisis. And one thing's for certain, South Africa is in the epicenter of a major crisis, along with pretty much the rest of the world at this point. Then I'd love to talk about the issue of inclusivity and the opportunity that we have to really leverage the catalyst of change that we see and that we refer to as the health crisis. But what's that really going to do to create a new chapter for growth in the South African economy? And very much want to get into some of the thoughts and detail of what we're learning from our experience in COBRA in dealing with now about 150 enterprises that have come through COBRA, and perhaps just talk about the jumpstart approach and what we're learning in terms of business models, dynamics and changes for success. So if that sounds like it's of interest, then hopefully we won't see the attendee list suddenly plummet. So Sifiso, why don't you pop up on the screen and we could just have a brief conversation. And by the way, Maurice, you said this was an on the couch session. My colleagues will know that I find it really difficult to stand still or sit still for very long. So if you don't mind, I'm not on the couch. I'm going to stand up and move about. I was having a session the week before last with one of our COBRA partners, Richard Mulholland from The Missing Link. And I noticed that he was also standing and had a stand-up desk, but he was rocking from side to side, and he would go from one side to the other, but without really shuffling his feet. And I realized after I asked him, he was standing on what he called this balance board, which had a cylinder in the middle of it. And the balance board helps you to tip from one side to the other. And he said to me, it's very good for your core. So one of the most important things, I think, in this crisis is to stay fit. So I've asked Richard, he said he's going to send me over one of the balance boards that he has there. So maybe the next time you'll see me, I'll be going from side to side. I'm also reminded, I should just let you know that my chiropractor said to me one day, your best posture is your next posture. So moving up and down, using different types of chair are really good ways to keep your energy up. Right, talking of energy, Sifiso, we finally start to see the opening up of our economy again. And I know you were on ENCA rapidly after the presidential address and on various news services. And what appears to be happening is that we're moving from the very tight regulation of all the different sectors into more of a monitoring of protocols the requirements of workplace plans being in place, the maintenance of social distancing, and all those factors. I heard you speak on Sunday night about how important it is to get the balance right between safeguarding lives and safeguarding livelihoods. Can I just ask you, maybe just talk a little bit about that and your thoughts about how we've got to get this right in this new phase of the lockdown?
Thanks, Adam. And, you know, I worried a bit that once I show my face, some of the participants might just run away. But I did try to put on a bit of makeup this morning just to make my face a little bit more palatable for everyone. I think, you know, so a lot of the thinking has gone around, and a lot of the argumentation has tended to follow a very binary view around it's either lives or livelihoods, and that, you know, the initial process that we followed was accelerated towards saving lives. And we saw that South Africa, I think, you know, certainly stood up in a global context in terms of, you know, the pace at which we responded. And as a result, we've had, you know, I think generally more favorable outcomes compared to many of the economies globally. And so there was certainly a lot of, you know, respect in terms of just the choices that from a leadership point of view are made in terms of the health accelerator. The challenge then that follows is then what happens from an economic front. We modeled, for example, that, you know, a hard lockdown would have an impact of about 42% in terms of output in the economy that would, you know, that just wouldn't take place. And so that's, you know, and because in a South African context, we've got what we call, you know, elasticity, which is how labor responds to reductions in output. That elasticity is about 1. And therefore, you can expect that if there's a 40% reduction in output in the economy, you can expect 40% reduction in hours worked. And that, I guess, probably strengthened the noise and the voices around, you know, economic participation in the economy and truly opening or reopening the economy to ensure that, you know, the question, a lot of the questions that were, or a lot of the points that were made is that either people are going to die from COVID or from hunger. And so the question is, how do you then ensure that people don't die from hunger as well as don't die from COVID? And, you know, an important thing around that conversations and is around moving away from a binary view of lives or livelihoods, but rather getting into a constructive space of lives and livelihoods. And by that, you mean that there are, you know, there's ways in which we can approach the economic planning and economic strategy that, you know, still observes, you know, social distancing, you know, requirements for the economy and keeps people away from points of contact as we had initially seen during the hard lockdown. And so, you know, the view is, one, we know that there are sectors that were able to operate in a hard lockdown context. One such sector, for example, is e-commerce, and e-commerce can, you know, operate while appreciating the need for the distancing. And so the question is, what are the opportunities for us to accelerate e-commerce? And so there was a lot of pushback around some of the restrictions on e-commerce because they were argued to be nonsensical in the sense that they wouldn't put people's lives at risk. And so I think the thinking is around, now that the foot is on the health accelerator, let's put the foot on the economic accelerator. And that foot has got to be targeted towards sectors that still maintain the social distancing requirements that preserve people's lives. And so I'll make an example and say one of the challenges our textiles industry in South Africa, you know, had was once we became a signatory to the World Trade Organization, we had to then reduce our tariffs from 1991 to 1996 from 70% to about 20%. And that resulted in our textiles industry being materially non-competitive in a global context. And one of the reasons is because South Africa hasn't been able to achieve economies of scale in the textiles industry. So if we know now, for example, that there's this move towards deglobalization because of COVID, and countries are looking for insourcing. Borders are closed for certain, goods coming in and out of the ports. And so what does it mean for us to build textiles capacity to a point where we can achieve economic competitiveness through scale as well as inclusivity? One of the arguments I made is that we know that there are companies in the country who've got really strong online supply chains. If we are able then to bring in some of the smaller textile makers in the economy and legislate for a minimum requirement of smaller homegrown textile producers to be on those supply chains to ensure that then we can consume truly and honestly, proudly South African, you're making the supply chains there inclusive, but also you're enabling people to be economically active. And so the thinking then is certainly that there are really rich opportunities in the sectors that enable people's lives to continue to be protected, but for us to now build capacity. And I think that's it's been the cornerstone of the South African issue is around the capacity story. And so what does it mean for us now to certainly look towards a capacity enhanced economy versus a consumption enhanced economy? And those were some of the thinkings then around that. Don't remove your foot off the health pedal, but put your foot on the accelerator from an economic front to ensure that we were able to have the right level of economic participation in an inclusive way as well.
So, Sifiso, let's just go back one step in our kind of context setting for this conversation. And let's have a bit of a leveling around what we think the economic impact or the contraction is outlooking at this point. And I guess the context for that on the front page of Business Day today, Dr. Miriam Altman, who is a member of the National Planning Commission, is saying, as a fellow economist, she warns against permanent COVID-19 job losses. And the context from last week's Reserve Bank statement and repo rate reduction was that the bank is now forecasting in the region of a 7% contraction in the economy for 2020. Now, the span of economic predictions on that particular measure, I've heard ranging from 7% to 20%. You've just spoken about the massive impact and the shock factor that if we don't see the economy re-energize and open up, that we could see an even worse situation. And in fact, Dr. Altman says in her article that the worst case scenario could be worse. Now, I haven't heard anybody at this point say, well, the best case could get better. We're still in the shock factor. Where do you think we are going to, based on the changes that we're seeing happening, the opening up at this stage, do you have a view or a prediction of what that contraction is outlooking?
So, I mean, we've observed some of the content that's been put out there from a Stats SA point of view, as well as the National Treasury in terms of some of the reports that they've put together, as well as then us, doing our own piece of research that we'll be releasing quite soon. And the first thing, which was quite interesting and links to what Dr. Altman talks about, is the fact that there are a lot of jobs that will be lost that won't go back into the economy, primarily because of the cost of remaining closed for certain businesses. And so we saw in the largest employing sectors, so that's wholesale trade, we saw at some point at the stage 5 lockdown, about 56% of the companies through the Stats SA surveys having halted activity completely, and they've actually shut down. And so, we also know that this is the sector that lends itself to the largest proportion of unskilled and semi-skilled labor. And therefore, it's pretty hard imagining how those jobs will come back into the sector when those companies don't come back into economic activity in general. And so there's certainly then the view first on that there's once gone and forever gone companies that we're seeing, and that will result in a similar output from a jobs front. Over and above that, there's certainly then the issue of investment from companies. So when companies don't know and there's uncertainty, this is the whole thing around the cost of uncertainty to productive levels in the economy. Companies currently don't know, even the ones who are currently economically active don't know what will happen. And therefore, it's hard for them to make any investment plans for plant, for any other operational investment activity that they would be partaking in. That would ordinarily be business as usual. And that creates a second round of dampening in terms of the expected output in the economy. We saw, for example, AngloGold Ashanti having 164 miners, and they were operating at 50%, and they had 164 miners being infected and they had to close down the mine. And that particular mine makes up about 7% of their gold production capacity in the for the group. And these are the things that we're expecting to see more of, where businesses are going to have to reclose their operations because of accelerating infection rates. We've seen it happening in hospitals, we've seen it happening in retail stores, and these hard lockdowns almost takes it back to a stage 5 for that particular business, because then they just can't operate. And then the issues of inventory control, because now you've restocked on your inventories depending on the kind of business that you are, and then those inventories can't go back into the marketplace. Over and above that, we understand that the South African economy, 60% of it is attributable to household expenditure. Mm-hmm. And so when you're expecting job losses, on the top end of about 7 million, as expected by, worst case scenario by National Treasury, and also, as I mentioned earlier, right, that because of the elasticity of one between output and employment outcomes, it means there's almost a directly proportional decrease in labor participation once there's a particular decrease in output production.
So Sifiso, just repeat that number again. This is a National Treasury forecast in terms of the worst case scenario, in terms of job losses?
Yeah, the worst case scenario is 7 million from a National Treasury point of view. I think while that's the worst case scenario, it's not necessarily the base case. And so I think we've also got to be able to have that textured view around that. And what it does really, I think it allows us to plan for the base case, for the middle road, as well as the worst case, and say what does it mean for our choices, given our view of what the potential outcomes could be. And I think that goes interestingly contradictory to what Minister Patel spoke around, the needlessness of forecasting in how we deal with the pandemic. And so what we are looking at is that if we have the current, phased approach of moving from stage 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, in terms of reducing stages per month that we've currently been observing from a governmental point of view, we already expect, a quarter-on-quarter reduction in GDP of about 23, 24%. And when you think about that, that's quite a material and quite a stark reduction in GDP, and the implication I think is going to be felt in the second and third round effects. And so what usually happens is that we usually see a first round impact that you'll see, and you'll see some companies currently responding and they're reducing working hours, etc. And then we saw the fiscal response, people applying for UIF benefits and all of the other solidarity projects. And then eventually when the reality sinks in that we're in this for quite some time, and then the second round and third round effects are certainly going to filter in. And so I think the utterances from Dr. Altman around that the worst case could be worse is certainly, I think, a valid consideration. But I think we must also allow ourselves, I think, to transition between the various scenarios and what informs each of those scenarios. And just the last point I'll make there, Adam, is that one of the things that I think was amiss in how we thought about which sectors must be economically active and mustn't be, I think, is the framing of the problem itself. I think we ought to have looked at the problem as which sectors mustn't remain open instead of which sectors must remain open. Some sectors, for example, have hard fixed costs, and so it's hard to operate that particular business at 50%. And so some of the businesses have tried and they've incurred more debt, and others have just chosen not to operate at all. And so once you've sunk a shaft in the mining context, you can't unsink the shaft, or you can't commission 50% of that particular shaft. And we know, I think, most of the open cast mining in South Africa that's happening is manganese, and we're the second largest or largest manganese producer in the world. But outside of that, most of our mines now are quite deep. Our gold mines are some of the deepest in the world. We're no longer mining on surface with platinum and PGMs. And we know that, for example, platinum is used for jewelry as well as autocatalytic converters in cars. And so we've seen a 98% reduction in terms of sales from NAMSA, which is the Vehicle Automotive Association. And of course, people are not buying jewelries because of depressed consumer demand. And so when you look at then the broad impact of trying to get these companies to operate at 50% when they are already operating in a COVID impacted economy, it certainly makes the impact I think a lot more severe than it could have been had we taken a different approach.
So there were many points that you made there, and I'd like to pick up on just a couple. You were talking about the ineffectiveness of forecasting at this point. I see there's a data point this morning that's come up from the CEO of Remax, the property company, and what the CEO has said is that if they compare May of 2019 to May of 2020, in terms of registered deals through the Remax organization, this time last year, 1.6 billion in deals, and as of May 2020, 110 million. So a 93% drop for that business year on year in terms of trading activity. You touched on the what I heard was the potential for an economic depression. And I'd just like us, before we move out of really the context setting, to just really frame that. So from my data points, the Great Depression of the 1930s resulted in a 15% global contraction in GDP. And we'll talk about GDP, perhaps whether it's the right measure or not, a little bit later. But you're now talking about, in the South African context, in excess of 20% contraction. And my understanding of an economic depression is that there are two factors in my mind. One would be long-term recessionary cycle that just keeps going on for many years. And secondly, what really characterizes it is the specter of bank failures and a fundamental implosion of some of the financial structures that are there. I'd argue that we've already had our first bank failure, which is Land Bank. It's obviously a very small one, but it's a leading indicator. What's your view? What's the potential? Are we more than 50% or less than 50%? You can't sit on the fence, heading towards an economic depression in South Africa?
We are, in my view, certainly less than 50%. We did see a spike in distressed lending already from January, and it accelerated materially in February and March. But I think if you just look at our banks, we've got the capital requirements approach that we do in terms of a macro prudential regulatory point of view. Most of our banks were overcapitalized as per Basel III, which is the global guideline around capital requirements. Most of our banks were materially overcapitalized along all of the various capital measures. And what that means is that that created a buffer for those businesses to absorb losses in terms of credit default. And so I do think that our banks are sufficiently capitalized to, I think, withstand the pain of higher default ratios that we're probably going to see, kind of filtering into the system. And interestingly enough, what the banks had started doing even prior to the economy being COVID impacted, is that they understood that their bread was buttered in the supply chains of the businesses that were banking with them. And so they started banking the ecosystem and say, how do we help the people who inform your business? And so they started trying to put in place some programs, for example, to support the businesses that inform the revenue line items for the businesses that bank with them. And I think that was quite a smart and innovative way of thinking around ensuring that you protect your client through taking care of their supply chains. And so I think this, that certainly started moving, I think, our banking system to an interesting point of maturation around this idea of shared value. And I think that will certainly be an important contributor to the outcomes that we're going to see from an economic point of view. I also don't imagine that the economic slump will be drawn out for too long, primarily because we weren't too far from the bottom as the country, to be honest with you. Structurally, there was a lot that needed to be changed. And we're finding ourselves now, I keep saying that the president is in an opportune time to actually effect a lot of the things he would have ideally wanted to effect with as little consultation as possible, primarily because of the power vested in the National Command Council by virtue of the National Disaster Act. And therefore, we, even in the context of this COVID-impacted economy, we're starting to see the value of the social compacting, right? For a change, and for the first time, I think in many years, we started seeing how businesses, labor, private sector, public sector, and civil society have come together to say, how do we solve this economic problem together? And I think the opportunity for South Africa certainly lives in a socially compacted environment, and it's not a private sector initiative imperative alone, not a public sector one, and not a labor issue alone. And so I think now we're starting to move towards a particular kind of, I think, economic spirit as a country where social compacting is becoming more of a way of doing business. And I think that's probably the thing that's going to ensure that the economic slump is not drawn out. I think also in understanding some of the social investment that needs to happen, things like a universal basic income grant. We're seeing earlier versions of it coming in now through this 350 temporary grant, but there was, the Taylor Committee in 2003 that was given the task to figure out whether or not South Africa was in a space to, employ a universal basic income grant, and they came back with findings that we ought to phase in a universal basic income grant. And one of the thinking around that is also given the fact that South Africa has got a 55% poverty rate, and that means 55% of our population live below 581 Rand a month, that people, and there's numerous evidence that when there's the existence of a universal basic income grant, people can discriminate around where they spend in terms of food, healthcare, and everything around that. And as a result, there's better nutrition outcomes, there's better educational outcomes, and there's better health outcomes. And so these are some of the things now that are starting to come into the conversation also, that I think we'll certainly start to see a kind of inclusive developmental progression for the country, over and above then the capitalistic structure that lives on top of that. And so I think on the back of that particular reasoning, I wouldn't imagine that we've tipped over 50% in terms of a probability of economic depression.
So Sifiso, there was a lot of positivity in what you just said, and I wasn't expecting you to be so positive. So I'm really delighted at this stage, as we are in the eye of the storm, that you are outlooking a number of positive factors. Let's stay in that vein for a moment, and if I may, I'd like to share my screen with our webinar participants, and just take us for a moment through to if I can pick it up here it comes. Hopefully you can see on your screens a little bit of theory around the Kondratiev wave. I think in terms of the positive vein that Sifiso has set us off on, it's useful for us to consider the experience of cycles that we have been through over many decades, over centuries, as you can see here. And I think that's particularly important for us at this moment, that we are in such a critical crisis. And indeed, I heard a global forecaster 2 weeks ago describe the current crisis as the greatest shift in humanity ever. So the cycles that you see here relate to cycles of capitalism and growth. And each of these cycles, you can see whether it was the first Kondratiev of the steam engine, which was brought down crashing by the general crisis, the panic of 1837. The second that was brought down by the long depression. Well, it was only 6 years, so from my view, it wasn't that long. The electrification cycle that we saw and the boom of capitalism in that period, that actually was flattened by the Great Depression. Now we're getting a further, they obviously couldn't call it the longer depression at that point, but it became the Great Depression, but it was 4 years longer or so than the long one of the previous cycle. Then the fourth Kondratiev, in terms of the 40 years of the boom of the automobile, and of course what brought that down to ground was the oil crisis and the pressure point that really leveled the situation. And then into the fifth Kondratiev, the 40 years, which has all been so focused between 1970 and 2010 on the boom, the technology boom and communications boom that we've seen over that recent period, brought down to earth by the financial crisis and the impact of the global financial crisis really taking us into negative territory. And then what we would suggest is the sixth Kondratiev, which has all been about the last 10 years, focusing on the environment, technology, biotechnology and healthcare. And there's good news, bad news, of course, because what's happening right now is that the COVID-19 crisis has really brought that down to a level. And if we believe what the global forecaster Dave Murren said, that we're in the greatest shift in humanity ever, then we're really into that negative space. And what's interesting is that the Kondratiev wave has only lasted for a very, very short periods over the last 10 years. But what I'd like to suggest to us in terms of building on the positivity of what you were saying just now, Sifiso, is that we're in a new chapter, and every one of those cycles, capitalism has in effect reinvented itself. And that reinvention has come with a new technology boom or new business models or new solutions and new ways of creating value. And I'd like to just frame in the thought process for us here that one of the things that we're seeing, which quite frankly I think is really remarkable, is the response from society in terms of recognizing what you were saying about shared value and a need for a focus on inclusive growth and inclusivity. And I've been talking to my fellow COBRA initiating partners about one little story I'd like to share. And the story is called The Little Ships of Dunkirk. And The Little Ships of Dunkirk relates back to a situation in the Second World War, pretty much in the early stages of the Second World War in 1940, when the Allied troops were seeking to advance through France on the German troops. And the Germans were well prepared, and through a pincer movement were able to push some 350,000 Allied troops onto the beaches of Dunkirk, and they were moving in for the kill. And that particular part of the coastline in France has very shallow waters. So none of the Navy vessels from the British Navy could make it into those shallow waters, and they couldn't do anything about the situation. Soldiers were walking into the sea up to shoulder level, in danger of drowning. The Luftwaffe were sweeping down and machine gunning them in the water. And in fact, what happened is a parallel or a metaphor for what we see happening in COBRA at this point. And the little ships refers to about 850 privately owned vessels. These were fishing boats, these were cruisers, these were essentially flat-bottomed boats in the River Thames around the southeast coastline. 850 of them set sail over to Dunkirk. And the story goes that they rescued 350,000 troops by ferrying those troops out to deeper water onto the bigger ships, or in many instances, bringing them back to the coastline of England. And it's an amazing story of success, because had that not happened, the war, according to Sir Winston Churchill, would have been lost. And the reason why I think the metaphor or the story is very relevant to us is that the president has said that there are some 700,000 enterprises in the formal and informal sector that need help in South Africa at this point. And the 500 billion rand rescue package and the various initiatives that government is focusing on is realizing that that rescue really needs to be launched. And what we're seeing, as Maurice was saying earlier on, with the first 35 companies and enterprises that have joined the COBRA consortium, is that those ships have left harbour and are sailing to the cluster of SMMEs and larger enterprises that need help, that are in distress, that need rescue of some shape or form to be able to bring them back to sustain those enterprises for a future economic growth opportunity. So, Sifiso, let's build on that positivity, and let's perhaps talk about, just very quickly, when you talk about inclusivity, what is it that you're referring to, and why are measures like GDP perhaps not the right way for us to be characterizing the situation or the potential that we should be moving to?
So, I mean, I think the interesting thing about GDP is that it's, it measures output or uses output as a measure of development. When you look at, interestingly enough, even the phases of, or the various capitalism phases that we currently looked at now, a lot of the developments in those periods were not so much driven primarily by output, but also by a particular innovation and a particular process. And so the industrial processes, as they came over the years, changed the way of work, in essence, before they changed the level of output in the economy. And so the number of things that changed the way of work, for example, I'll make the example that if we've got a certain kind of investment in early childhood development, that improves the social mobility potential for those kids. It improves their education outcomes, it improves their health outcomes. And yet we don't have measures of unpaid caregiving in economic growth, right? And so the investment we make at an early stage doesn't get reflected in how we talk about economic growth, and that's just one of the examples. And stages of human development are also not modeled appropriately in economic growth. And interestingly enough, if you listen or if you reflect on Paul Romer, who's 2018 Nobel laureate for economics, his his theory that I guess became quite famous is the endogenous growth theory. And in essence, it said that technology cannot happen and innovation cannot happen absent the human capital development component in the conversation when we think about long-term economic growth. And when we then look at all the companies that have been interesting rising stars, whether you talk about the Asian tigers, etc., some of their largest investments were towards human capital. And therefore, the measures of development that are centered around the person are certainly probably more valuable in how we think about economic development as you know, I think a separate way or a different way than just looking at GDP. I think GDP doesn't tell you enough of the story. In a South African context, I'll make the other example that, you know, we've had jobless growth for 12 years. And so while we've had GDP growth on an annual basis, we've had a declining participation or absorption of employees. And therefore, that number, that GDP number, is not as meaningful as it ought to be in terms of how we look at it. And so what's the real labor problem that we should be looking at when we're talking about growth? And then we'll start to see the gaps in development from a South African economy point of view. And I think those are some of the things that will also usher us into the conversation of inclusive growth. They'll usher us into the conversations of value, right? I always make the example that the structure of the South African economy historically has probably led us also to the capitalistic structure that lends itself right now, is that, you know, mining is the one sector where the word exploitation is seen as a positive thing, right? You say, we speak of exploiting resources. And I think it's tended then to carry itself into how businesses have done things in South Africa. It's tended to be very exploitative in nature, whether you look at, gender parity issues or race parity issues. You start to see a lot of those inequality gaps, you know, kind of living out in the corporate structure in the economy. And so when we think around then value creation in the context of how we measure development, I think that's certainly going to be quite an interesting term. And it also, I think, forces businesses to think around the reason to exist. Is that when you exist as a bank, it's financial. What are the value points in financial intermediation? Let's reimagine those so that banks start to play a more developmental role that doesn't compromise their profit outcomes. And if you're a legal firm, what is the reason for existing in the context of value? And so I think we now need to move towards this view of our own economic participation from a value lens. And I think that will start to certainly close some of the gaps that have existed in various ways that have resulted in non-inclusive growth for the South African economy.
So, Sifiso, when we talk about the need for structural reforms, or we talk about the need for the South African business and government and social community to come together, we've really got to address this issue of growth and inclusivity. And there could be a very positive outcome from the catalyst of the health crisis in really driving those conversations, but not just the suggestion that we need to move in a different way and measure our progress using different metrics, but that we actually start to do that and take the lead, and not only have South Africa highly regarded around the world in terms of the way we're dealing with the health crisis, but to move forward and take a step forward in how we deal with the economic crisis. Now, I want to get very practical because we started to get a number of questions that are coming through from the participants. And there's some real practical realities about one of the questions here, that many small businesses have been declined from the various rescue or support packages available from government, such as UIF or TERS funding, or even some of the private sector funding from the SA Future Trust or Sakuma Fund, because they haven't got their tax clearance certificates in place, or they are unable to demonstrate the track record. They may have a good business, but they haven't got their ducks in a row, and the health crisis has really exacerbated a decline in their businesses. I want to just mention, and perhaps just to answer that point, that two of our COBRA partners really have got a fantastic perspective on this. One is Gigi Alcock, the writer of Carsonomics, and really has got a superb perspective. And we're going to be running a webinar with Gigi in the next couple of weeks, where he'll take us through the work that he's been doing also with the Department of Small Business Development and his work for the Business for South Africa initiative on some of the practical realities and steps and how we need to overcome that. Secondly, Alon Reyes from Reyes Corp. Reyes Corp has over 600 SMEs that they're working with that cover the informal and formal sector. And it's really important that we leverage the knowledge base and skill set that exists there and the broader community of COBRA partners to quickly get good businesses properly compliant and into a position. And then using the COBRA Knowledge Hub that Sifiso and the team have created. And that Knowledge Hub is available via the website and is updated on a daily basis. It's reached a point right now where there's actually too much information in terms of the long list of initiatives from government, from the banks, from the business sector, from NGOs. And just explain to us, perhaps, Sifiso, how you're going to create a little bit more structure around that to make sure that if you are turned down in one area, that you can learn from that quickly and maybe apply in other areas or leverage the Knowledge Hub.
I think, it really starts by, answering the question around, what are the pressure points that businesses experience, in terms of crisis. And it's usually either a financial pressure point, an operations pressure point, or, I'd call it a legal pressure point, as call it three broad, maybe a fourth one, we'd call it a structural one. And that's where issues of governance, risk, and all of that would come in. And so what we're trying to do is to take the lens of the problems that you would ordinarily be facing and help you navigate through that particular approach. And so actually, let me get to the solution quicker. I've got a financial issue. What does my financial issue look like? And then you cascade and get to the body of knowledge that will inform you on who's running the initiatives that can solve for your particular issue. And if you're unable to find that, what are the other opportunities? And I think this is the amazing thing around the COBRA structure, as well as then the partners that are in the ecosystem, right? It's a marketplace where over and above all the initiatives that are currently taking place in the economy, there's also then this last port of call and say, I haven't been able to find support, but I need funding. I know that there are funding partners in the COBRA consortium. How do I get into conversations with them? And I think it's quite important for us to find various ways to create these ecosystems. Because it's often very hard to know where to go once the bank has said no to you. And I think the value point around, let's first give you as much information as possible. If you're unable to find the necessary help through the information we've given you, let's give you then the technical support as well as the network effect that will hopefully get you to the desired solution. And I think that's one of the really interesting value points here. And in the point that you are making, actually, interestingly, about the companies in the South African context, I spent some time thinking about the last tax statistics that we're observing, and there were 3.2 million companies registered with SIPC. I think there were 814 that were assessed for tax. There was 200,000 that actually paid tax. And 57% of the corporate income tax collection came from 380 companies. right? And that means that there's such an intense corporate concentration in South Africa that when you see a big company like Comair, for example, SAA, Edcon, going into distress, the impact that it's got from a labor point of view, from an output point of view, is so immense, given the extent of the concentration of large organizations in South Africa. And so the first thing we ought to do actually in reimagining this economy is around actually making marketplaces more inclusive for small and medium businesses to participate, because it actually diversifies the risk from an economy point of view. Because right now we've got businesses, I'd argue, that are probably too big to fail, primarily because of the impact of their failure on the broader economy. And so I think in the reimagining of this economy, we certainly need to make sure that the work that's done by the Competition Commission around ensuring more sustainable participation of smaller businesses, as well as the work being done by the likes of Raise Corp to help small businesses, I think, accelerate into growth, is certainly going to be really, really interesting for an intra-COVID economy as well as a post-COVID economy.
So let's really just use that final thought, I guess, in the last couple of minutes of our webinar. As we reimagine the future and we look for growth opportunities, Sifiso, the COBRA initiative has really focused in on what we call the jumpstart approach. And there are 5 categories of businesses that we've engaged with during the last 8 weeks of the existence of COBRA. And they fit into the jettison, uplift, mothball, pivot, or start categorization. Unfortunately, for a number of those businesses, they are not going to make it through the economic crisis. And when we talk about jettisoning those businesses, it's vital that we move quickly into a liquidation stage to protect the underlying asset base. And the reason for that is to enable that asset base to start something new, to be able to build a new future for the owners of that business, the stakeholders and the customers of that business. Then when we talk about the uplift, mothball or pivot elements, that really aligns into the business rescue engagement and the process, whether it's through us supporting through information and subject matter expertise or into a structured business rescue process. In each case, to preserve the business, these are good businesses, either to uplift that business, to enable, for example, new e-commerce capability and to then grow that business in a new marketplace. If it's a good business that needs to be mothballed and protected, or if it's a business that sees an opportunity to pivot in a traditional market space that is not growing at this point, where with the same product offering, it is able to really grow and pivot into a new space. If you want more information on the Jumpstart methodology, then please, again, jump onto the COBRA website and post your request for information and support. And really, I think at this stage, when I think we should consider our position as being in the eye of the hurricane at this stage, it feels very calm, but the hurricane of our dual crisis of the health crisis and the economic crisis is at a very early stage, and we are beginning to see the impact that that's having on our economic situation in South Africa. Sifiso, I've really enjoyed talking to you. I always learn a great deal and love your energy and your perspective, and in particular, very unusually, the positivity that you've brought into the conversation about the future growth potential post-COVID-19. So thanks very much, and thanks to Maurice for the opportunity for us to lead this webinar today, and hope to all of our webinar participants it's been a valuable use of your time. And once again, please tune into COBRA. Back to you, Maurice.
Yes, yeah, sorry, Adam. A question has been posted, so I'll ask Sifiso. Do you believe that Kate Raworth's donut economics theory could practically guide us to develop better economic measures? And do you believe that limiting growth is something that we could practically implement to move into the sustainable donut that Kate Raworth proposes?
I think the South African challenge is quite a unique one because of the structural constraints that we've got in terms of our economy, and so when we think about what are the levers for growth in a South African economy, as I alluded earlier on, is a human capital investment. It's R&D, and so we are way behind in our R&D investment than we should be. I mean, I'll make an example of Israel. 10 years ago, they were drought-stricken, and now they've got some of the best desalination technology in the world, right, in terms of being able to process seawater into consumable water. And now the agriculture sector is thriving on the back of that. And their investment into knowledge economy as a proportion of GDP is above 5%, and ours is just below 1%. Our target is 1.5% R&D spend as a proportion to GDP, and our GERD is currently below 1. And so we certainly aren't making the right level of investment to be able to compete sustainably in the future. And then also it's questions around issues of social resilience. South Africa has got an issue, as we've said, around even the education conundrum in South Africa is complex relative to other countries by virtue of many things that inform that. I'll make the example and say in rural South Africa, some of the schools can't get the right capacity because homes are so far away, and as a result, some schools will have 100 kids. That means you have one teacher teaching 5 different subjects. So now there you've already got some leakage that's going to happen in terms of educational outcomes, and that's just structurally defined. And so when we talk about the education problem in South Africa, it's not a kind of you just brush it in one way, and the various nuances that inform the challenge, and therefore our responses need to be textured and different. And over and above that, then it's from the resilience lens is health resilience as well as climate resilience. If you look at KZN, every single year there are floods, and that wipe dozens of homes out, and that creates a lot of infrastructural shortages, as well as lives lost, as well as health outcomes being weakened. And these are all the resilience measures that would inform how you get into the conversation around this donut economy. And so I think once we get to a more textured understanding of the complexity of our economy, then our responses will certainly then be, I think, more targeted towards solving for the right issues to ensure that we get into the sustainable growth path in an inclusive way and a sustainable way.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. That's a wrap. Thank you very much to the panelists. That was truly insightful. Sifiso will be on again on Friday, I think. Other webinars we have on Friday at 10 o'clock, we have insights from Fleet Elite, leveraging the assets in your balance sheet to raise capital in times of crisis. So we have that one. And then I think there's another. Let's have a look here. We have workplace compliance. That's tomorrow at 10 o'clock. So please join us for those webinars. Thanks for joining us today. Please go to our website, www.cobra.org.za. All our webinars have been posted there. So previous targeted webinars from last week and before are there. And that's where you'll also find the knowledge base that we spoke of. So thank you very much. Until tomorrow, have a great day. Cheers.
Bye.